Good evening. Good evening. Oh, Miss Reshma, are you? Uh,
Hello.
yeah. Can you please mute?
Oh, one second.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Reshma. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, ma'am.
Okay, let's begin. So yesterday we talked about the Caribbean poetry by Derek Walcott and Edward Brathwaite, and we come to know that Derek Walcott was a Nobel laureate in literature, and we discussed about two poems from Derek Walcott and two poems from the collection of poems by Edward Brathwaite. So today we go to the next chapter, not a chapter but a different genre altogether. So this is day 7 today, and the novel that we are going to study upon today is The Solid Mandala. It's written by Patrick White. So, what we will do is we will first check with the author's background. We talk about the literary career, the works or the achievements. We talk about a little bit of the author here. Then we know about a bit about Solid Mandala as a book. We talk about the characters. We talk about the key aspects of the setting, the plot, and we pick important passages from the novels, and we discuss about the themes and the other critical analysis. So let's begin, starting first with the author's background. Patrick White is the author here for the book The Solid Mandala. Patrick White was a prominent Australian author celebrated for his rich, complex prose and profound exploration of human nature. Here In this book, we will come across lot of scenes and lot of characters we will meet where you will find yourself relatable to exploring the human nature. So, Patrick White, full name was Patrick Victor Martindale White. He was born in May 28th, 1912, in London, and he passed away in September 30th, 1990, in Sydney, Australia. He was born into a wealthy family. Although born in London, he was brought to Australia at 6 months old and spent much of his childhood on his family's property in New South Wales. White's first novel was Happy Valley, written in 1939, and it was set in the Australian outback, and it dealt with the themes of isolation and disillusionment. However, it did not gain much attention, but again, he started writing. More of his works were The Living and the Dead, that was written in 1941, The Ernst Story, that was written in 1948. He began to showcase his distinctive style, focusing more on the psychological landscapes and the complex character studies. His major works include The Tree of Man, Was, Riders in the Chariot, The Solid Mandala, that is what we are going to study today. And all of these major works, they highlight the themes of mostly the human conditions, like the themes of endurance, the themes of survival, the themes of the existential journey, the themes of faith, suffering, mysticism, themes of duality, identity. So he's basically into the inner psychological explorations. Mostly in most of his novels, you'll find that. In 1973, Patrick was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for an epic and psychological narrative art which has introduced a new continent into literature. And talking about his achievements, he received the Miles Franklin Award, that is the Australia's prestigious Miles Franklin Award, multiple times for his works, including Was, Riders in the Chariot. These are the major works of his lifetime. He was awarded again with the Nobel Prize in 1973, and he became the central figure in the Australian literature. Patrick White is regarded as one of the most significant literary figures in Australian history because his work deeply influenced the development of Australian literature, and his works brought international attention to the country's literary scene. Despite his international acclaim, Patrick White was known for his reclusive nature and often expressed disdain for the public attention that often came with his success. His complex characters, intricate narratives, and profound themes continue to resonate with readers and scholars worldwide. Moving ahead with the book today, The Solid Mandala. Patrick White is the author. He's divided the book into four parts, four major parts. Each part focuses on the different aspects of the lives. Especially, there are twin brothers here that we are going to uh, closely look up. They are Waldo and Arthur Brown. So the novel is not divided into chapters. This is the thing here that you'll understand, that the novel is not divided into chapters but four parts, like I mentioned. and it's written in a very traditional sense. Now, these four sections of the book, they delve deeply into the character's perspective. So each character is been given parts, and there we will explore their inner lives and the dynamics of their relationships. So, part one, there is the chapter part one. The name of the chapter is In the Bus. Now, this section introduces the central characters, two brothers, Waldo and Arthur Brown, and this section sets the stage for the exploration of their lives. Now we come to part 2, and the part 2, the name is Waldo. Like I mentioned earlier, each part is delving, or like say picking characters, and we will be delving deep into these characters' perspectives. So the names of the parts or the sections are divided accordingly based on the names. So part 2 is Waldo, and this part is again divided into three sections. So it is 1 by 3, 2 by 3, 3 by 3, focusing on Waldo's perspectives and his experiences and his intellectualism and the emotional detachment. Then we come to part 3. We talk about Arthur Brown. This part is also again divided into two sections, 1 by 2, 2 by 2. This part presents Arthur's perspective. The previous one was Waldo's perspective. This is Arthur's perspective, which in you'll come to know in many senses both the perspectives are different, and here we understand author's simplicity, spiritual insight. The last part is based on Mrs. Polter and the Jade Guest. This section brings in Mr. Polter, another character in the narrative, and this part addresses broader themes, including the cultural and the spiritual zeitgeist of the time. Now, these parts contribute to novel's exploration of the duality and interconnectedness of the two brothers, each part delving into different aspects of their personalities and lives. The structure serves to provide a multifaceted view of the characters, themes, symbolical significance of the mandala in the novel. Setting of Patrick White's The Solid Mandala is primarily in the suburbs of Sydney, Australia, during the mid 20th century. The novel portrays the lives of twin brothers, Waldo and Arthur Brown, who live together in a modest house in a working class neighborhood. The suburban environment is depicted as ordinary and mundane, reflecting the brothers' seemingly uneventful lives. Now, talking about the key aspects of this setting, you will find there is this suburban home, the Brown brothers' home, which is central to the novel. Now, this home symbolizes their shared life and the contrast between their personalities. House with its cluttered and old fashioned interior represents the stagnation and monotony of their existence. There is a local library. This is also one of the key aspects of the setting. A local library, which is an important location in the novel, especially for Waldo, who spends most of his time there. It symbolizes his intellectual aspirations and his sense of superiority, though it also highlights his isolation from the broader world. The streets and the neighborhood, these are also some of the important key aspects. The novel frequently depicts the streets and the local shops, emphasizing the routine and repetitive nature of the brother's life. The suburban environment is portrayed as somewhat suffocating and reflective of the character's inner confinement. Now, as we move ahead, we will explore themes of isolation, duality, search for meaning in ordinary life. This is what happens to many of us when we have a mundane life, when we have a uneventful life. We often look ahead to search for meaning. The suburban backdrop provides a stark contrast to the rich inner worlds of the character, particularly authors' spiritual and mystical insights. Let's start with part 1 in the bus. Part 1 in the bus of Patrick White's The Solid Mandala serves as the noble's introduction, setting the stage for the intricate exploration of two central characters, Waldo and Arthur Brown. This section provides a glimpse of their lives, personalities, and the dynamics between the two brothers, twin brothers. Who are the characters here? Waldo Brown, Arthur Brown, Mrs. Poulter. If you understand Waldo Brown, he's more intellectual and critical between the two brothers. He's a very self conscious person, pessimistic, and he has a sense of superiority over others, including his brother. Now, Waldo's life is dominated by a sense of unfulfillment and frustration. This is what happens in real life also. You would generally want to give a sense of superiority over others only when you are having a life of unfulfillment and frustration. Here we see Waldo also having the same condition, which he often projects onto those around him. Definitely, he would want to feel superior by imposing his powers to people who are weak. So, if he powers over them, only then he would feel powerful. That is his only way out. There's the next character, Arthur Brown, the younger one. Not the younger one exactly, but the second one. Arthur, in contrast to Waldo, is simple minded, kind hearted, and more spiritually attuned. Though he is perceived as a slow or a simple one, Arthur possesses a depth of understanding and empathy that Waldo lacks. Look at the beauty of the creation here. Twin brothers, two brothers, one of them highly dominating, the other one highly empathetic. His character represents innocence, acceptance, and more mystical approaches towards life. There is Mrs. Poulter here in the first part, that is in the bus. Mrs. Poulter is a minor character in this section who appears on the bus. She is a neighbor of Arthur and Waldo Brown and represents the ordinary judgmental perspective of the suburban society. Like many times, we also have neighbors who are judgmental of what we do. So they observe quite a lot and they would have their own point of view. So also Mrs. Poulter, although a minor character, but she's representing the society as a whole. Her observations provide a contrast to the inner lives of Waldo and Arthur. The plot summary is that in the bus opens with Waldo and Arthur on a bus journey through their suburban neighborhood. The bus ride serves as a microcosm of their lives, with the brothers seated together yet existing in their own separate worlds. The narrative shifts between their thoughts, revealing the differences in their perceptions. Waldo's perspective, because he is absorbed in his intellectual superiority and disdain for the mediocrity around him, Waldo views other passengers, including Mrs. Poulter, who represents the society, with contempt. His thoughts are filled with resentment, particularly towards his brother. author, whom he sees as a burden and an embarrassment. Now, focusing on author's perspective, author is more at peace with the world around him. He notices the same people as Waldo, but with compassion and acceptance. His thoughts are simpler, but they carry a lot of wonder and a connection to something greater than himself. Author's solid mandala subject, a small, the subject of this, the topic of this novel. Where does it come from? Author's solid mandala, a small object he carries, symbolizes his inner harmony and spiritual depth. The bus ride, while seemingly uneventful, encapsulates the essence of their lives, Waldo's frustration and bitterness contrasted with author's serenity and spiritual insight. If we go ahead to do the critical analysis of the contrast characters, two brothers, you'll find that this section effectively introduces the central theme of duality through the contrasting personalities. Two brothers and two different, separate, contrasting personalities. Waldo, representing mind, rational, critical, often disconnected, while author, embodying the heart, emotional, accepting, and spiritually aware. The symbolism of the bus, why the part is characterized as or the named as in the bus. The bus journey here is a metaphor for life itself. Like you're going in a bus in a journey, but here it's a metaphor that it's the journey of life. That is what the bus is representing. With the characters moving forward together yet in isolation. Both the brothers are sitting together, but they are in their own separate worlds. This clearly symbolizes that although the characters are moving forward together, but they are in isolation. The public bus is an everyday setting reflecting the mundanity of their lives, but also becomes a stage for exploration psychologically and spiritual based themes. Here, Patrick White, the author, shifts seamlessly between the brothers' internal monologues, allowing the reader to see the world through their eyes. Now, this technique emphasizes the subjectivity of experience and the divide between what is appearing and what is in real. If you focus on the themes, we find duality and contrast, the most prominent themes in this section, through two brothers, representing the intellectual versus the spiritual, cynicism versus innocence, mind versus heart. The bus setting also is underscoring the theme of isolation and connection, both isolation and connection in a equally shared space. The brothers are physically close, but emotionally they're distant, each trapped in his own world of thoughts. The next theme is perception and reality. The contrast between Waldo's and author's perception of the same environment highlights how different realities can coexist based on one's inner life. Waldo sees the world as a harsh and a disappointing state, while author finds beauty and meaning in the ordinary. Talking about the fourth theme, which you would find spirituality and materialism. Author's connection to his solid mandala symbolizes his spiritual grounding, in contrast to Waldo's preoccupation with intellectual and material concerns. The mandala here represents a wholeness that author understands intuitively, while Waldo dismisses it as mere foolishness. This is what happens in real life too. You will always meet two different kinds of people. One focusing the goals or paths or moving ahead through brain, and the other always focusing through the goals and purpose through the heart. Now, what does Patrick White intends to tell in the opening section? What does he want to express in the opening section? He perhaps wants to establish the dichotomy between the brothers, setting up the novel's exploration of how human condition can be. This opposition that he's trying to set through Waldo and Arthur, he is trying to examine the tension between intellect and emotion, isolation and connection, search for meaning in a seemingly indifferent world. He tries to perhaps expose the human flaws which is deeply sitting in everyone's mind, let's say, psychological insights. He is trying to expose the flaws of both the characters, Waldo's arrogance and Arthur's simplicity. Too much of arrogance is not nice, too much of simplicity is even not good. However, they also are required in some extent, in some bits and pieces. Now, the suburban setting that the novel starts with and the mundane bus ride reflect the critique of modern life emptiness and the ways in which people try to cope up with. He contrasts Waldo's cynical approach with author's almost mystical acceptance, suggesting that the latter offers a more fulfilling path. He comes to this conclusion already that if you are more spiritual in nature, you happen to have more meaning in your existence and your purpose is clearer and you have a more fulfilling life. But why is this concept of mandala here introduced? The concept of mandala. Anybody exactly tell me what do you mean by mandala? How many of you know what mandala is? Can somebody say what is mandala? You commonly know it as the mandala art form. Yes. Can you describe it a bit, Sushri? Circular, you say. What else? Circular. Is it always circular? Does it necessarily have to be circular? No. Yeah, you're true. Modern mandala is not circular. Yeah. Overall, no. Overall, the form of mandala, any of the form of mandala, does not necessarily be circular, but it can actually be of any geometric uh, shapes or size. Any geometric configuration can be possible. It's mostly one of those, I would say, a kind of a conventional way uh, of art and form where you are focused and um, you are attentive, you are using a kind of a space and you are accommodating one beautiful design into it. Although it has, its a connection to many of the deities that represent it. Many of the religions follow it. But so yeah, that is it. So basically, if you really want to be focused, or there are very intricate designs involved, any of the geometric configurations or symbols. So I don't know how many of you practice it, but if you try it, you'll find there is a lot of peace around you, and you are spiritually connected to whatever you do, because it makes you more attentive, it makes you more mindful. Okay, thank you, Sushri. So yes, traditionally it is circular, you say, as its name suggests. Okay, fine. Okay, then let's move ahead. So this chapter is the art of mandala is introduced here. The concept of mandala, which symbolizes completeness and spiritual unity, and it is very subtly, implicitly introduced through author who is possessing a solid mandala. This is a kind of an object that he's holding, and it becomes the central symbol in the novel, representing the possibility of achieving harmony and balance in life. In this book, Patrick also invites readers to look beyond the surface of everyday life and consider the deeper spiritual and psychological forces that shape human experiences. It's therapeutic, definitely, yes. You're right. Gives you a lot of peace. So let's start with the passages, important passages from part 1. As Waldo stared out of the window, the familiar streets unrolled themselves in all their exasperating monotony. Each shop, each house provoking him a fresh wave of resentment. This is Waldo's perspective. We already got an idea of what perspective generally Waldo carries, because he's too intellectual. So he's uh, focusing mostly on all his purposes and goals through his mind, and he believes that everyone else around him is inferior to him. So the passage is very simply written. As Waldo stared out of the window, the familiar streets unrolled themselves in all their exasperating monotony, each shop, each house provoking him a fresh wave of resentment. Now, this clearly tells that how isolated and how discontent he is. Waldo's is Waldo's deep-seated frustration and unfulfillment with his surroundings, that is clearly mentioned. The repetitive imagery of the streets unrolling emphasizes the monotony of his life, reflecting his inability to find joy or satisfaction in the ordinary. Waldo's resentment here towards the mundane aspects of his environment underscores his critical nature and his detachment from reality. He sees the world as dull and oppressive, which is a projection of his own inner turmoil. Definitely, because you are internally so disconnected, you would always find resentment in everything around you, in your surroundings. The streets represent the path of life, and for Waldo, this path is tiresome and unfulfilling. This contrasts with author's perspective, which is who is more accepting and spiritually attuned of the same environment. Look at the contrast how two people from the same family, twin brothers, look at life so differently. Next passage. Arthur, however, sat with his hands folded on his lap, looking about him with mild curiosity. He seemed to find a kind of comfort in the bus familiar rattles and groans. This passage highlights the the sharp difference between Arthur and Waldo. We already come to know what is Waldo's point of view, where he sees monotony and feels resentment. In a different hand, Alto finds comfort and curiosity. And this thing is already very familiar to him, like his is the words used. In the bus, familiar rattles and groans. He's very familiar to this situation. He has come across this situation in previous many times, but still he finds comfort and curiosity. This is not a mundane thing for him. Even if it is mundane, he still finds comfort or pleasure out of it. This reflects author's ability to find peace in the ordinary, a trait that sets him apart from his brother. Author's folded hands and calm demeanor suggest a sense of acceptance and serenity. The body language is clearly presented here. How he sits with his hands folded on his lap, and this clearly suggests that he is accepting everything around him just the way they are. Unlike Waldo, who intellectualizes everything, Author is more in tune with his immediate surroundings, embracing them with an open heart. For Author, the bus, with its rattles and groans, is not a symbol of life's burden, but rather a familiar and a comforting presence. This suggests that his spiritual approach allows him to find contentment where others find frustration. Waldo's eyes narrowed as they focused on Mrs. Polter. He despised her for the faint moustache on her upper lip, for the ill fitting coat that she wore. She was one of the many people who failed to live up to his expectations. Now, as we read, we'll come to know by the words which is mentioned whose perspective is what. Definitely, the words that I use ill fitting coat and eyes narrowing. He despised her for the faint moustache on her upper lip, failed to live up. So, most of the time, you'll find these words where Walter's point of view comes up there, mostly negative. And he feels that, he is the superior one. This passage reveals his judgment, Waldo's judgment, and the critical nature that he carries. He focuses on Mrs. Polter's appearance and he disdains for her reflects his sense of superiority and his harsh standards for others. Waldo's inability to connect with others is evident here. If you keep on judging people, you would never be able to connect. He isolates himself through his judgments, building walls between himself and the rest of the world. His contempt for others only deepens his sense of loneliness and dissatisfaction. Here, Patrick White may be using Waldo's character to critique societal tendencies, to judge others based on superficial traits, the external appearance. You base your opinion. Waldo's obsession here with appearance and his disappointment in others reveal his own insecurities and lack of deeper connection to humanity. Next passage. It was enough to hold the mandala and feel it warm in his hand, as though he was cradling something alive, something that could offer him understanding and consolation. Clearly, this passage is for author because the words are enough. Holding something to feel the warmth, understanding, consolation, these are all positive words. So definitely both between both the characters, author is the positive one, so this is his perspective. The symbolism of mandala is expressed here. In author's hand, the mandala symbolizes wholeness, unity, spiritual enlightenment. For author, it is more than just an object. It is a source of comfort and understanding, representing his deeper connection to life and the universe. This passage highlights author's mystical side and his ability to find meaning in symbols that are beyond Waldo's intellectual grasp. The warmth of the mandala signifies the warmth of life itself, something author instinctively understands. Here, again, we find a contrast while Waldo searches for meaning through intellect and remains unfulfilled. Author's connection to mandala suggests true understanding comes from a place of emotional and spiritual awareness. This difference between the brothers is central to the novel's exploration of duality, and perhaps now you come to know why part 1, the chapter name, the part's name in the bus, is so essential. Just the name of the topic suggests so many things together. Next passage. Sometimes author would turn to Waldo with a look of inquiry, as though seeking to share his wonder at something only half understood, but Waldo would ignore him, pretending not to notice. Look at the kind of resentment Waldo is carrying for his brother. Waldo believes that Arthur is an embarrassment, so he's pretending to ignore. He's ignoring, pretending not to notice. So, this passage tells about author's desire to connect with his brother, the body language that he's looking towards Waldo with a look of inquiry. He wants to connect with his brother, he wants to ask something and share his sense of wonder, how he feels about things. He wants to share that with his brother. This is so definite. When we have something with us, we would literally want to share that with our siblings. So, that is what he is trying to do up here. This shows that author's understanding of the world, though not fully intellectualized, is deeply felt and meaningful to him. And look at how Waldo rejects the look. Waldo deliberates his ignorance to author's attempts at connection. This clearly mentions his emotional coldness and inability to engage with the world in a more profound way. It highlights the emotional distance between the brothers. The scene emphasizes the theme of alienation, not just between the brothers, but also within ourselves. This is so relatable as human beings. Waldo's rejection of author's attempts at connection is symbolic of his rejection of both the emotional and spiritual aspects of life, which leaves him isolated and bitter. Now, overall, part 1 provides insights into the contrasting characters of Waldo and Arthur, the perception of the world, and the thematic underpinnings of the novel. Patrick White uses these contrasts to explore broader questions of identity, meaning, and the human condition, setting the stage for deeper exploration in the upcoming sections of the novel. The bus ride, though ordinary on the surface, becomes a profound metaphor for the journey of life and the different ways individuals navigate it. What are your views regarding part 1? How do you find part 1? What are your views? Who is your favorite character? How many of you can relate to Waldo? How many of you can relate to Arthur Brown? How many of you act through brain? How many of you act through heart? Anyone? You may please type down your answer if you want to. Depends upon. Okay. Okay, Sushi. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for your response. Okay, let's move to part two. Part two is Waldo. We come to know more about Waldo, while we also, at some point, we will um, understand author's point of view also. But this part is divided into three subsections: 1 by 3, 2 by 3, 3 by 3, and it is mostly from Waldo's point of view, how he sees the world. So, Waldo is central to this section. Waldo is, we know already, he's intellectually inclined, he's introspective, he's emotionally detached character, he is deeply frustrated because he had been failing all his life, and it's not failure actually, it's his perceived failures, and struggles with feelings of inadequacy, particularly when it comes to uh, in relation to his brother Arthur. Waldo's inner world is dominated by self-doubt, sense of superiority mixed with self-loathing. Now, Arthur Brown is there in this part too, but is not the central character. He's less central, let's say. He continues to be, although a significant presence. His simplicity, spiritual contentment, unwavering kindness, they stand in stark contrast to Waldo's complexity and emotional turmoil. We again find some significance, reappearance of the minor character, Mrs. Polter. She's again representing the ordinary judgmental perspective of the community. Her interactions with Waldo further highlights his feelings of alienation and his disdain for others. We also meet Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown, the parents, in this section, who are referenced in Waldo's memories and reflections. They symbolize the familial expectations and dynamics that have shaped Waldo's and Arthur's identities. Now, the plot in this second part, part 2, and this is the first segment, the narrative delves into Waldo's inner thoughts and memories, offering insight into his complex personality and the roots of his deep seated frustration. The focus is mostly on Waldo's childhood and early adulthood, exploring his intellectual aspirations, his relationship with his family, and his ongoing struggle to reconcile his sense of superiority with his persistent feelings of failure. Waldo is portrayed as a young man with a great intellectual ambitions. His aspirations are continually thwarted by his inability to connect with others and his failure to achieve the success he believes he deserves. His self perception as a misunderstood genius isolates him further from those around him, including his family. The relationship between Waldo and his parents, especially his father, is fraught with tension. Waldo feels misunderstood and underappreciated, leading to a growing resentment that exacerbates his sense of isolation. His interactions with his brother are marked by a mixture of disdain and jealousy, as Waldo struggles to comprehend Arthur's simple and contented nature. Throughout this part, we'll find Waldo's internal monologue reveals his deep resentment towards the world and those around him. He views author simplicity and contentment, perceiving them as signs of inferiority, yet he is simultaneously envious of author's peace of mind. Themes that we will come across are themes of isolation, intellectualism, family dynamics, search for meaning throughout. Let's go ahead with the passages. Waldo had always believed that he was different from others, destined for something greater. But as the years passed, the evidence of his greatness failed to materialize. And this passage is important where we come to know that Waldo's internal conflict between his belief in his own superiority and the reality of his unfulfilled ambitions. It underscores the theme of isolation, as Waldo's sense of difference alienates him from others while also revealing his deep seated insecurity and disappointment. His father's gruff voice still echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of the expectations he had never managed to meet. So we see clearly the relationship between Waldo and his father, which is a source of ongoing tension and resentment. This excerpt emphasizes the influence of family expectations on Waldo's sense of self and his ongoing struggle to reconcile his desire for approval with his disdain for those who do not understand him. Arthur, with his simple pleasures, his contentment in the smallest things, Waldo could not understand how such a life could be lived, let alone enjoyed. This passage reveals Waldo's inability to comprehend or appreciate Arthur's simple, contented approach to life. It underscores the contrast between the brothers and highlights Waldo's arrogance and disconnect, which prevent him from finding the peace that Arthur experiences. Waldo had always viewed his intellectual pursuit as a way out, a way to rise above the mediocrity that surrounded him. But now he wondered if they had only served to trap him further in his own mind. Here, Waldo begins to question the value of his intellectual pursuits, recognizing that they have they may have isolated him further rather than providing an escape or fulfillment he sought. This introspection marks a very critical moment in Waldo's character development as he confronts the limitation of his intellectualism. The world was full of people like Mrs. Polter, and Waldo despised them all for their ordinariness, their lack of vision. But in his heart, he knew that he was as trapped as they were, if not more so. And this excerpt highlights Waldo's disdain for ordinary people, represented by Mrs. Polter, and his belief in his own superiority. However, it also reveals his growing awareness gradually of his own entrapment, suggesting a deepening sense of existential crisis as Waldo realizes that his intellectualism has not freed him but has instead confined him in a prison of his own making. Now, if you want to conclude this part 2, Waldo 1 by 3, Patrick White here offers a deep and a nuanced exploration of Waldo's character, delving into his intellectual ambitions, familiar relationships, and growing sense of isolation. Through Waldo's introspection and memories, while critics the limitations of intellectualism, the dangers of alienation, he also highlights the contrast between the two characters as representations of different approaches. This section plays the groundwork for the further exploration of Waldo's character and broader themes of the novel. We take a break here, okay, and then we meet with Waldo 2 by 3. This is again continued part 2, Waldo's 2 by 3 of the solid mandala. Take a break. Okay, let's resume. So, before we took the break, we finished Waldo 1 by 3 of the solid mandala. Now we start with the second part, Waldo 2 by 3, and let's proceed. We also find characters again, the same characters. Mostly, we are continuing with the focal character, that is Waldo, and his introspection becomes darker as he grapples with his unfulfilled ambitions. His relationship with his brother, Arthur, grows in the sense of existential despair. Arthur here remains a contrast to Waldo. We find a bit of his presence in this part. He represents simplicity, undoubtedly, kindness. We find a minor but a recurring character of Mrs. Polter again. And we also find the parents who continue to influence his thoughts and memories. Now, in the second segment, Waldo's internal struggles intensify. The narrative delves deeper into his psyche, exploring his feelings of inadequacy, his intellectual failures, and his complicated relationship with Arthur. Waldo's sense of isolation grows and he becomes increasingly bitter and resentful, particularly towards Arthur, whose simple contentment Waldo finds both mystifying and infuriating. Waldo reflects on his life's failures, his inability to achieve the intellectual success he believes he deserves, and his ongoing resentment towards the world. He becomes more entrenched in his belief that he is the superior one to those around him, yet he cannot escape the realization that he has not lived up to his own expectations. Waldo's interactions with Arthur continue to be strained. He views Arthur's happiness and simplicity with a mixture of disdain and envy, struggling to understand how someone so simple could be content. As Waldo's introspection deepens, his bitterness and resentment towards those around him, particularly Arthur and Mrs. Polter, become more pronounced. The themes again we find here in this part are the themes of isolation, alienation, and discontentment, contrasting perspectives, existential despair. Also, along with that, uh, there is a contrast between his self perception and the reality of his life, highlighting his existential crisis. Waldo's intellectual pursuits, rather than providing meaning, have only deepened in this chapter. His sense of despair continues to be central to this character's development. The unresolved tensions within the family contribute to his ongoing feelings of inadequacy and resentment. The isolation grows more and deeper as he becomes more entrenched with the disconnection around him. His resentment towards his family, his brother especially, his envy towards Arthur's contentment, contrast with his own dissatisfaction, highlighting the complexities of sibling relationships and the different ways individuals cope with life's challenges. Now, what does Patrick White wants to convey here? Patrick White continues to explore the complexities of Waldo's character in this section. He tries to delve deeper into his psychological struggles and the limitations of his intellectualism. While his intention to critique the notion that intellectual pursuits alone can provide meaning and fulfillment, he also illustrates through Waldo's character the dangers of the alienation and the existential despair. Let's focus on the passages of this segment. Waldo had always prided himself on his intellect, but now, in the quiet of his mind, he began to wonder if it had all been a grand illusion. This, this passage marks a critical moment again where the character development, he begins to question the value. The grand illusion suggests that Waldo is continuing to see the limitations of his intellect and the emptiness that has brought him, leading to a deeper sense of crisis. Author's laughter, so simple and unaffected, grated on Waldo's nerves. How could someone so simple be so content? These questions keep on coming to his mind. He just cannot stand the simplicity of author, and the laughter of author does only bring him dissatisfaction. The walls of his mind were closing in, and Waldo realized that his intellect is gradually becoming his prison. This passage underscores the theme where Waldo's mind, once his refuge, has become a prison now, and that is trapping him in his own thoughts and prevents him from connecting with others. The walls represent here the barriers that his intellectualism has created, isolating him from the world. He had spent so much time looking down on others that now, as I look around, there was no one left to see. Clearly, his image of looking down on people has made him feel empty of his own existence. In the end, it was not the world that had failed him, but he who had failed to find his place in it. This is such a beautiful line, and this so happens with many of us. We blame people of not leading up to our expectations. However, the fact is, this is us who fail up to find any place around them. This passage encapsulates the central theme of Waldo's crisis. He comes to a realization that his failures are not the result of the world's shortcomings, but his own inability to find meaning and fulfillment. So, concluding, Waldo 2 by 3 White deepens the exploration of Waldo's character, focusing on his intellectual struggles. Through Waldo's introspection, White critiques the limitations of intellectualism and the dangers of isolation, while also highlighting the contrast between Waldo and author are representations of different worlds together. We go to the last part of Waldo 3 by 3. Waldo's psychological and emotional journey reaches a critical point. His crisis culminates in a series of personal and social confrontations that reveal the depth of his isolation. and the ultimate failure of his intellectual pursuit. His sense of despair intensifies, his inability to reconcile his intellectual aspirations with his lived reality leads to a dramatic breakdown. Now, this section, 3 by 3 of Waldo, explores the culmination of his existential crisis and the final unraveling of his character. We find some climatic confrontations, Waldo's interaction with other characters, including author and Mrs. Polter, become more strained and revealing. His confrontations with his characters highlight his growing sense of failure to connect meaningfully with those around him. The narrative reaches a resolution as Waldo's internal conflicts come to a head. His realization of the futility of his intellectual pursuit and his profound sense of isolation mark the climax of this character. Critically analyzing this particular part where we find Waldo's character, there is a complete collapse of his previously held beliefs and aspirations. There is a final breakdown in a direct consequence of his failure to integrate his intellectual pursuits with his emotional and social realities. The section illustrates the consequences of Waldo's intellectual arrogance and emotional detachment, providing a sobering critique of his worldview. The continued contrast between Waldo and Arthur highlights the differences in their approaches to life. Arthur's simplicity and contentment serve as a counterpoint to Waldo's despair, emphasizing the limitations of Waldo's intellectualism. Waldo's interaction with minor characters and his ultimate downfall serve as a critique of societal norms and expectations. His alienation reflects a broader critique of the way in which societal values can contribute to individual despair. This section is critical because it highlights Waldo's end of intellectual pursuits. Theme highlights the limitations of relying solely on intellect. This is what is the main purpose of the novel. Patrick White really wants to convey that limiting or relying solely on intellect to find meaning and fulfillment will only lead you to downfall. Waldo's existential crisis showcases the profound despair that can result from an inability to ever reconcile personal aspirations with lived reality. The themes of isolation are fully realized here in this section, reflecting Waldo's complete detachment from the world and his ultimate breakdown. The contrast between Waldo and Arthur is further emphasized, illustrating the different ways individuals approach life and find meaning. Now, what might be the purpose of the author to bring or to write in this section? Maybe that he wants to get Waldo's existential downfall to its logical conclusion, demonstrating the consequences of his intellectual arrogance and emotional detachment. While critics the limitations of intellectualism and explores the profound impact of isolation on individual well being. Through Waldorf's character, White examines the way in which societal values and personal feelings can intersect to produce not only a despair, but also a complete downfall. Let's focus on the passages. In the quiet of his final moments, Waldo saw the futility of his entire existence laid bare before him. The grand ideas that once consumed him now seemed nothing more than empty illusions. Clearly, the word futility of his entire existence. This is the climax, this represents the climax of whatever Waldo ever knew. The futility of his existence here highlights the complete collapse of his intellectual pursuit. Empty illusions reflect the disillusionment Waldo feels as he confronts the reality of his life. While author's peaceful acceptance of his fate was a bitter reminder of Waldo's own failures. How could someone so content exist alongside someone so tormented? Keeps on asking this question in all the parts. Just cannot stand, or because maybe he simply did not understand ever. So the passage here talks about the profound contrast between Waldo and Othir. He cannot stand the fact how can someone be so content or satisfied with his life existing alongside someone who is already so tormented. Othir's peaceful acceptance becomes a source of bitterness for Waldo, definitely, highlighting the disparity between how they see the life, how they perceive life, and the ultimate failure of Waldo's intellectualism. Waldo felt as though he were on the edge of a precipice, staring into the void of his own making. His once proud intellect now seemed like a cruel joke. This passage captures Waldo's sense of impending collapse and the realization that all his intellect are nothing but futile. The void of his own making reflects the internal emptiness and despair that Waldo faces as he confronts the consequences of his intellectual pursuits. The world outside continued its indifferent march, oblivious to Waldo's anguish. His personal despair seemed to have no impact on the broader reality he could no longer connect with. Absolutely miserable. This passage emphasizes Waldo's profound isolation and alienation. The indifferent march of the world reflects his sense of disconnect and how the world is completely not paying any heed to what breakdown Waldo is going through, the broader reality highlighting his complete detachment from the world around him. In the end, Waldo realized that his greatest failure was not in achieving his goals, but in his inability to find meaning in the simple moments of life that he had always dismissed. This passage clearly maintains Waldo's ultimate realization. His greatest failure is not related to his achievements, but to his inability to appreciate the simple moments of life. This realization underscores the novel's critique of intellectualism and the importance of finding meaning in everyday experiences. Part 3, Waldo Part 3 by 3. Patrick White here concludes with Waldo's character with a powerful exploration that the consequences of Waldo's intellectual arrogance, also critiquing the societal norms and values. Through Waldo's final breakdown and ultimate realization, Patrick provides a commentary on the search for meaning and the dangers of detaching oneself from the simple everyday aspects of life. We now talk about part 3, a new part, a new segment, and this will continue with 1 by 2, author 1 by 2, and author 2 by 2. This is where we focus on the second character, second most important character after Waldo. We see there is Arthur Brown here. The focus here is Arthur Brown. Although we also find a bit of Walter Brown, although he's not the central focus. And then there will be other characters, definitely Mrs. Polter, and various minor characters also found. Uh, the focus shifts to Arthur Brown in the section where Arthur is portrayed as a contrast to his brother Waldo, embodying simplicity, contentment, sense of spiritual fulfillment. His character provides a counterpoint to Waldo's existential crisis and intellectual struggles. Waldo is not the central focus, as I mentioned, but his impact on Arthur and their relationship remains significant. Arthur's perspective on Waldo and their interactions provide insight into their differing worldviews. We come across Mrs. Polter representing the community, further highlighting the contrast lives of Arthur and Waldo. There are other supporting characters who contribute in bits and pieces to the setting and social dynamics that influence Arthur's life and decisions. In the first part, 1 by 2 of Author's section, the narrative provides a deeper exploration of his character and experiences. The plot delves into Arthur's simpler, more contented existence compared to Waldo's complex and troubled life. We focus on Arthur's daily life, his approach towards life, how he is depicted as a grounded individual who finds happiness in simple moments and maintains a sense of peace despite external challenges. His perspective is far different from his brother Waldo, providing insight into their relationship at times. Author's contentment and spiritual peace stand in stark contrast to Waldo's existential despair. Author's interaction with Mrs. Polter highlight his relationship with the community and his ability to navigate social norms with ease. These interactions further emphasize the contrast between author's simplicity and Waldo's complexity. Author's character is developed as a foil to Waldo. His simplicity and contentment offer a different perspective on life, highlighting limitations of Waldo's intellectualism. There is a theme of simplicity versus complexity, how the life contrasts. Social dynamics is clearly maintained, and there is a spiritual fulfillment that author sense peace everywhere he goes and does things. This character embodies a form of happiness, exploring the idea that meaning and contentment can be found in simplicity and acceptance. Author's life embodies the alternative representation of Waldo's intellectualism. Let's start with the passages. Passage 1 of Author 1 by 2. Author woke up each morning with a sense of quiet satisfaction, finding joy in the routine that others might find mundane. This clearly signifies the daily routine of author contentment, the quiet satisfaction he derives from the mundane activities, emphasizing his ability to find joy and fulfillment in the ordinary, contrasting sharply with Waldo's existential dissatisfaction. He looked at Waldo with a mix of pity and bewilderment, unable to understand how someone so intelligent could look so unhappy. Look at the contrast in the previous section where Waldo was having this perspective of how someone so simple be so happy versus author's point of view, how someone so intelligent be so unhappy. Look at the various perspectives. This passage talks about author's perspective on Waldo's struggles. The pity and bewilderment indicate author's difficulty in understanding Waldo's existential despair, highlighting the contrast between their approaches to life and their respective sources of fulfillment. Author's interaction with Mrs. Poulter were marked by a genuine warmth that contrasted with Waldo's cold indifferences. Genuine warmth, the phrase highlights the ability to connect with others on a personal level. In the simplicity of his life, Arthur found a profound sense of peace that eluded those who sought meaning in complexity and struggle. This passage captures the essence of Arthur's contentment with simplicity, the profound sense of peace he experiences contrast with the complexity and struggle that Waldo, on the other hand, is characterizing. Authors, Author realized that while Waldo wrestled with grand ideas, he himself found solace in the small, everyday moments that others might overlook, illustrating the different parts of meaning and fulfillment. This passage highlights author's realization of the value in small, everyday moments, the ability to find solace. To conclude this chapter, the part 1 by 2, White here provides a deeper exploration of author's character, focusing on his contented and spiritual fulfilled life. This section contrasts author's simplicity and peace with Waldo's intellectual struggles and despair through author's perspective. White highlights the themes of simplicity, social integration, offering a counterpoint to his brother's Waldo character. 2 by 2, author 2 by 2, we meet Arthur Brown, who remains the central character. We meet the description of Waldo Brown, Mr. Mrs. Poulter, and other supporting characters. The plot remains where the section examines how author evolves as a character, his interactions with others, including Waldo and Mrs. Poulter, reveal his development and the ways in which his understanding of life deepens. Author's internal and external conflicts are resolved, providing closure to his character. His relationships, particularly with his brother, reach a resolution that highlights the impact of their contrasting approaches. Author's role within the community and his interactions with other characters continue to be significant focus. The section illustrates how author navigates social dynamics and finds fulfillment within his social context. Author's character continues to develop, reflecting his journey towards personal development and spiritual peace, personal fulfillment and spiritual peace. His growth is contrasted, in the other hand, if we look into parallelly with Waldo's point of view. The theme of simplicity, social integration are resolved. He continues a journey where he offers resolutions to the exploration of his themes. The contrast between author and Waldo is further emphasized, particularly in terms of their resolutions. And this section also explores how author's social interactions and community involve involvement contribute to the sense of fulfillment. Let's focus on the passages. Author looked out at the world with a sense of quiet satisfaction, finding beauty in the small, everyday moments that others often overlook, clearly symbolizing the grand ideas which Waldo's hold, in contrast with Arthur's way of simplicity, living a quiet satisfaction. The resolution with Waldo was bittersweet. Arthur recognized the futility of their differences, but accepted them as part of their complex relationship. He realizes that the relationship between both the brothers are complex, but he accepts it. He accepts that such differences will stay. He acknowledges the inevitability of their differences. He understands that, but he believes also in accepting and personal growth. Author's interaction with Mrs. Poulter were marked by transcendence, the superficiality of their social roles, the depth of author's relationships. This is what the line is illustrating, especially with Mrs. Poulter, who is representing the society. The genuine connection he shares with his people around him reflects his ability to form meaningful relationship within his social context. In the quiet of his own reflections, authors found a profound sense of peace, knowing that he had lived a life of acceptance and simple joy. Profound sense of peace reflects his ability to find fulfillment through living simply, highlighting the central theme of spiritual peace. The community's acceptance of author was a testament to his ability to navigate social norms with grace, contributing to his overall sense of fulfillment. This line emphasizes the theme of social integration, author's ability to navigate social norms, and the community's acceptance of him underscore his successful integration into his social context and its role in his fulfillment. End of Author 2 by 2. White provides a comprehensive exploration of author's character, focusing on his personal growth, relationship, resolution of his conflicts. Section highlights themes of simplicity, fulfillment, and social integration, offering a contrast to Waldo's struggles. Through Arthur's journey, White explores the effectiveness of finding meaning in simplicity and acceptance, providing deeper resolutions to the themes and characters developed throughout the novel. The last part, Mrs. Poulter. Now, who is Mrs. Poulter is actually the central character in this part who is representing the perspectives of society and the prevailing cultural and intellectual climate. She represents the social and the intellectual dynamics of the era, providing a lens through which the entire story is being explored. Waldo's influence persists as the narrative explores his impact on Mrs. Poulter and her views. Author Brown, although is not the primary focus here, but his presence continues to influence the dynamics between Mrs. Poulter and other characters. Plot summary of part 4, Mrs. Poulter. We see that the focus shifts to Mrs. Poulter and her engagement with cultural and intellectual climate of her time. The narrative explores her perspective on societal norms, intellectual trends, and her interactions with other characters. Mrs. Poulter is a social commentary who provides a critical examination of the contemporary social and intellectual trends. Her observations and interactions reflect her views and her role within it. Interactions with Waldo and Author in between, the dynamics that she shares with Waldo and Author continue to play a role. Mr. Poulter's interactions with these characters highlight her influence, providing insights into her character and the broader themes. Now, Mrs. Poulter character serves as a vehicle for exploring her social commentary of the time, the broader societal perspectives, critical examining of these trends highlight the interplay between individual views and the broader cultural shifts. Now, let's focus on the important passages of part 4. Mrs. Poulter observed the intellectual fads with a mix of amusement and disdain, recognizing their superficiality while also acknowledging their impact on society. This passage captures Mr. Poulter's critical perspective on contemporary intellectual trends. Her amusement and disdain reflect her recognition of the superficial nature of these trends while also acknowledging their influence, illustrating her role as a social commentator. In conversations with Waldo, Mrs. Poulter found herself both challenged and validated as his radical ideas often clashed with her more conservative views. I'll repeat this passage for all of you. In conversations with Waldo, Mrs. Poulter found herself with we found herself both challenged and validated as his radical views often clashed with her more conservative views. This passage highlights the dynamic between Mrs. Poulter and Waldo that she calls the challenges and validation that she experienced reflects the tension between the thoughts that Waldo carried and the conservative perspectives that she carried, illustrating the complexity of their interactions and the broader intellectual debates. Whereas Arthur's presence in Mrs. Poulter's social circle provided a grounding force, contrasting with the more volatile influences of Waldo's ideas, clearly suggesting Arthur's role as a stabilizing influence in contrast to Waldo's radical ideas. The grounding force that Arthur provides through his speech highlights the different approaches to intellectual and social issues within Mrs. Poulter's circle. Mrs. Poulter reflections on changing cultural landscape revealed a deeper concern for the erosion of traditional values in favor of modern fads. This passage reflects Mrs. Poulter's concern about the erosion of traditional values. Her deep concern highlights the theme of cultural shifts and the impact of modern trends on established norms, illustrating her role as a critic of societal changes. Despite her critical stance, Mrs. Poulter's engagement with contemporary issues demonstrated her awareness of their significance even as she questioned their validity. This passage is important because it captures the complexity of Mrs. Poulter's engagement with contemporary issues. Her awareness of significance alongside her questioning of validity reflects a nuanced perspective on the zeitgeist, the defining spirit or mood of a particular period, illustrating her role as both a critic and a participant in the cultural and intellectual landscape. Uh, Part 4, we conclude with part 4, Patrick White, where he shifts the focus to Mrs. Poulter using her character to explore the cultural and intellectual climate of the time. This section examines themes of social commentary, intellectual trends, and cultural shifts, providing insights through Mrs. Poulter's reflections and interactions. Now, we understand the character of Waldo's Brown is important because he is having a perspective of isolation and the constant struggles that he's going through. We understand the importance of uh, Arthur Brown because he's into this spiritual uh, peace with himself, with the world around him. But how is part 1 so important and part 4 so important? The importance in this novel, where part 1 in the bus introduces the key characters and sets a stage, talks about the relationship between, primarily focusing on the Brown brothers. That stage was important. That part of in the bus, that part 1 was important. It talks about the symbolism and the setting, the character development in part 1, gradually rolling to part 2, where we discussed about Waldo 1 by 2, 2 by 2, and 3 by 2. Sorry, 1 by 3, 2 by 3, and 3 by 3. Then we move to Arthur Brown 1 by 2 and 2 by 2, and the last part, Mrs. Poulter and the Judgist. Now, the character develops gradually, uh, often being the central theme, and here we conclude with the characters and the themes tied together to various threads of the narrative, offering a final commentary on the character's journey and the societal issues they confront. The title, The Solid Mandala, is rich in symbolism, resonating deeply with novel's themes and characters, talking about the spiritual and the psychological symbol. Traditionally, as we know, mandala is a geometric figure representing the universe into Hindu and Buddhist symbolism. It often uses it often is used as a tool for meditation, symbolizing unity, interconnectedness of life. Psychological context, mandala can represent the self and the quest for personal integration. And by adding the term solid before the term mandala in the novel, the title suggests a grounded, concrete representation of these abstract concepts. It implies a more tangible and perhaps rigid or unyielding versions of the mandala's tradition or the symbolic that it is representing. So the novel explored the personal and social dynamics through the lens of symbolic and spiritual concept. There is a theme of self discovery, identity, quest for unity amidst internal and external conflicts. Solid Mandala underscores the tension between aspiration and reality, highlighting the novel's focus on the character's struggles, connects to the real life through its exploration of universal themes and human experiences. So, we stop here for today. Solid Mandala by Patrick White.